What further steps might the Russian Federation take?
He set new deadlines, he postponed them to next year, right? So basically, without any changes, the deadline can just be moved. That doesn't really solve anything for the Kremlin. We can say that thanks to the resistance of our troops, these deadlines keep getting pushed back again and again, but the goal itself doesn't change because of that. The capture of Pokrovsk and the Dnipro agglomeration, that's why attacks on these cities will continue. And there are no signs that they will be stopped. The enemy is trying to enter Hryshyn, bypassing Pokrovsk from the southwest and reach its northern outskirts. Hryshyn is a very important point. In other words, if the enemy manages to gain a foothold there, it will threaten the entire logistics network. The Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration, there will be the question of our troops withdrawing from this area if, of course, Hryshyn is captured. But the defense is holding there, meaning all these small groups, small infantry groups that the enemy sends in, are detected in time and destroyed. As for the situation in Pokrovsk itself, as before, there is fighting and the weather plays a very significant role. That is foggy weather, which, for example, in the mornings there, yes, it really interferes with aerial reconnaissance. And if there is no aerial reconnaissance, it becomes difficult to use drones, which are now a key factor in inflicting losses on manpower on both sides. That is, the Russian army also uses drones very actively. Then when the fog clears, it turns out the enemy has infiltrated some positions that were considered cleared just yesterday, and you have to start all over again. That's why any diagrams, any maps that we can see now regarding Pokrovsk unfortunately become outdated in a very short time. In other words, the situation is quite dynamic, and assessments like Pokrovsk is 80% under enemy control, or 90% may be accurate in the evening, but already outdated by the next day. So again, I continue to insist that it's too early to draw any conclusions right now.
About conclusions, yes, you are absolutely right. Even yesterday I was monitoring the map from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and today as well, and no matter how you look at it, there are certain moments where the same section of the front can change hands several times over a given period. Regarding strategic plans of the Kremlin, let's think about it this way. Let's discuss it given the current state of affairs. Yes, we know and understand perfectly well that the Russian Federation has enormous potential in missile production. They have partners like North Korea, Iran, Shahed Technologies, the production of these drones and so on. But no matter how you look at it, there is still some kind of bottom, some kind of end point. So what might that look like in this context? And could it happen for Russia in the the end of the exhausted resources for producing the huge number of missiles used to attack Ukraine? Are there any such prerequisites, in your opinion?
Yes, such an end could be in sight. It will manifest itself in the Russian Federation's economic inability to sustain military operations and simultaneously support the economy. People remain in Russia and they need to receive salaries. They need to receive pensions, they need to get certain social benefits, the utility system has to be maintained, some level of social support must be upheld, at least a minimal one. At the very least, ambulances must respond to calls, right? So it's not possible to just keep tightening belts indefinitely. Eventually you can break your back. Right now we are seeing very difficult economic trends in the Russian Federation. The budget deficit is growing and it cannot be covered, simply by raising taxes. All of this is a consequence of the sanctions. And the Trump sanctions, which were introduced a month ago, are only just now coming into effect, practically starting tomorrow. We still have yet to see their impact. But the sanctions imposed by our armed forces, our defense forces, and our drone forces are already having an effect right now. The strikes on oil refineries. For example, the Ryazan oil refinery was hit again last night. Reportedly, all of this plays a very significant role. Already, Russian economists are saying that the budget deficit in December, when all payments need to be settled before the new year, which is a standard situation for any budget, any at all, could reach 7 to 8 trillion rubles. That's according to Russian economists. And I want to repeat once again, it will be virtually impossible to cover this gap, and this will have a further cumulative effect as the war continues. It's impossible to wage war if the economy can't handle it. And we will eventually hit that bottom. The only question is when we will reach that bottom.
Now, regarding the strikes on oil refineries in the Russian Federation, How decisive could this be, or if not decisive, at least one of the most important levers of pressure on Putin, considering that the strikes are intensifying? And already, at least in the public sphere, Zelensky not long ago published a video of the launch of the so-called long-range Neptune, as well as the use of Flamingo missile drones and missiles on Russian territory. Obviously, these were aimed at oil refineries. So, in the case of increased and more frequent strikes on oil refineries, to what extent could this, if not break, then at least make Putin reconsider his stubborn strategy? But at least make him think a little.
Look, right now there's another peace plan circulating in open sources which was supposedly developed by Witkoff and Dmitriev, allegedly approved by Trump, and so on. So it's being presented as a roadmap for resolving the Russian-Ukrainian war. We're not going to discuss what this plan is, what it threatens us with, and so on right now. So I'll just mention one point that appeared there, and which wasn't there before. After all, we've previously heard various versions of these peace plans, with the Russian Federation putting forward conditions, ultimatums, and so on. So yesterday, if we are to believe the banned press, an interesting point appeared there. Among the mandatory conditions, the Russian Federation is demanding the reduction of, or depriving Ukraine of, long-range strike capabilities, those that could reach Moscow and St. Petersburg. This wasn't there before, but now all of this has appeared. And why has this appeared? Because it has an effect, and the Russian Federation feels it. And it wants to include this as a condition for further regulation of the war. This is important for them because they fully understand that our capabilities have increased and they directly affect the state of the Russian economy and its ability to wage war. So that's the answer to your question about what significance this has for Russia. And
so we literally have just a couple of minutes left for one more important point. These questionable points, yes, of course, right now we can't say exactly what's written there, but based on various sources, including Axios, NBC News, and now also The Telegraph is reporting as well. But it could be about forcing Ukraine to stop its rearmament. And Ukraine is currently very actively rearming itself to NATO standards and developing its own production. In particular, we're seeing this with long-range weapons and drones. There are also restrictions on the size of the army, a requirement to stop producing certain types of missiles, and a reduction in missile launch range. So, roughly speaking, it's kind of a repeat of what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In your opinion, in this context, how... Well, again, this is not a confirmed point. I'm just bringing it up for consideration. How much of a danger could this pose not only to Ukraine, but also to Europe?
at the present moment, the Ukrainian army is the only army in Europe that has combat experience. Frontline combat experience. And we are allies of Europe, and Europe is our ally. So it's all mutual and beneficial for both sides. On the other side of the barricades and the other side of the trenches stands the Russian Federation, whose army also has modern combat experience. And right now, we see that Europe is actively acknowledging the fact that any European country, a NATO member, could be next after Ukraine. And in particular, the Baltic states are under threat. Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, in other words, third countries. The only guarantor of security and stability in Europe is the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army is the asset that we can present as our contribution to the security system, the security structure of both Europe and NATO, and the European Union and NATO. That is why it would be quite advantageous for Russia to, let's say, diminish this asset a bit in order to further pursue its aggressive plans.
Denys, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the air. You're always welcome on Freedom. Denys Popovych.